Welcome back to Reimagine. Here we are in January 2021. Who'd have thunk it? We made it through 2020, guys. Good work to everyone. And so in keeping with the themes of this year, I've promised you all to bring you the best, most intelligent, most important, most influential voices in the space. And today, I certainly live up to that promise, being joined by Arthur Breitman, the co-founder of Tezos and one of the most prominent crypto founders and thinkers in the space. Arthur, first and foremost, thank you so much for being with us.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Absolute pleasure. All right, Arthur, I like to kick things off. I think the start of a year, and theoretically, depending on how you count it, the start of a decade in some people's minds is a good time to be speculative, but also a little bit introspective, perhaps. So I want to start this conversation by asking you, in terms of, no, you know what, in general, what's keeping you up at night?
Caffeine mostly.
And beyond the chemical inductions?
No, I sleep pretty well, but I would say I worry about the COVID crisis. To be honest, it's been a real disaster, and when I think that the vaccines were available in February, like it took a few days to develop the vaccine, and that's really a triumph of modern science and medicine, that we could get a vaccine with no live sample of the virus, just from data set over the internet. And then you're dealing with a super long approval process. And, I get it. You need to do some testing. You can't just you're not going to just inject the thing without testing it. Although I think if people are volunteer and it works for them, why not? But they should have done challenge trials. And even then, even after all the wait, they're screwing up the distribution. There's a bunch of vaccines. Vaccines are going in the trash. Vaccines are not being dispensed. It's just an utter and abject failure of governments to handle this. It's very frustrating. And I see there are thousands of people dying in the UK, for example, but all over the world, and it does keep me up at night. Yeah. And we have a tiny window. We see. I think it's it's peeling the veil on the abject quality of government handling of this crisis. But it's the same in every industry. That's the thing. It's they're no better at handling any other topic than they are at handling something like a COVID crisis. People forget that.
So, all right, I think all felt the sort of pains, the trials, the tribulations of the COVID crisis. I don't think there's anyone here who's been untouched, although that being said, obviously some have managed to spin it to advantages, innovations, and positivities. So let me take this from the general to the more specific when it comes to your sort of role and take on things right now. Now, obviously, you're spearheading a clear and distinct project in the crypto space, but where do you see the most important innovations either at Tezos or in general coming from other projects you may be working on coming in the next sort of short to medium term throughout 2021?
So there's no such thing as at Tezos. Tezos is not an organization. It's an open source piece of software. So there's with Tezos, there's on Tezos, but there's no at.
Correct. Correct.
Where do I see innovation? I mean, if are we talking just about the space of cryptocurrencies or the world in general? I think there's one of the most innovative things we've seen in the world has been in the space of AI. I mean, the work that's come out of GPT-3 and Wall-E is nothing short of outstanding and amazing. I think most people have not really realized just how good these things are getting and have not had the opportunity to interact with them. But it is a tremendous advance. I think, we were talking about COVID. mRNA vaccines are amazing because it turns something which used to be more art and science into something that's almost mechanical. So we might be able to see vaccines for a whole range of viruses being produced much faster than before. That's great news. If we're talking about, I expect a lot of listeners want to hear me talk about blockchains, but I'm answering the question for very broadly. For blockchains, yes, there's a ton of innovation in the space, and Tezos has been positioned from the beginning to harness that innovation. The idea is that every single blockchain project out there is an R&D lab for Tezos, because Tezos was built with an on-chain governance mechanism that allows it to adapt and adopt the innovation made by anyone in the space. So what are these innovations? there's been an explosion in the quality and the number of zero-knowledge proofs. Zero-knowledge proofs used to be extremely clunky. They were expensive, and you need to do this very complicated trusted setups. You now have a lot of options which don't have a trusted setup. They're faster, they're more generic. So there's been an explosion in this field of cryptography, which is super useful for cryptocurrencies. And one of the first things that I talked about on this matter in 2017, I wrote a blog post explaining, hey, zero-knowledge proofs are not just good for privacy, which is what they were being used for. They're also great for scalability. And so now you'll see a lot of projects like Ethereum, for example. They're centering some of their scaling solutions based on these zero-knowledge proofs. So they're super useful because you can do the computation once and then prove to everyone that you've done the computation without having them redo the computation. There's also been advances in terms of sharding. Again, the state of like what people were describing as sharding a few years ago was a little bit nonsense. It's now become a lot clearer how these things can work in consensus, in also smart contract language design and formal verification tools. So there's been an explosion of innovation in the space. And what's great with Tezos is that we can harness all of it.
Mm-hmm. And obviously, that is something that Tezos has been known for since its inception, this capacity for innovation, this capacity for adaptability and agility, which is a great strength of the network. But I guess this leads me to another point I'd ask, and this is something that I'm very interested in at the moment, in a period where we're going from, sort of a more consolidated phase in the space up to a sort of a hype phase and a bubble phase. I'm not just talking about the market itself, I'm talking in general, sort of about the crypto industry as a whole. But when we start to talk about this and think about network effects and start to think about the power of network effects in this space, I guess my question is, with the DeFi explosion we saw in late 2020 and the sort of overarching dominance that we're seeing, particularly from the Ethereum network at the moment in that space, as powerful and useful as innovation is from the technical side, in terms of a networking effect, where do you feel Tezos sort of lies in that space? And do you think that there's something that Tezos can bring to the table that makes it inherently appealing to the sort of more common user beyond the sort of deep technical understanding?
So first, let's talk about the explosion of DeFi in 2020. DeFi used to be decentralized finance, and to be sure, there have been protocols that do decentralized finance. MakerDAO is a decentralized finance protocol. Compound, decentralized finance protocol. Augur, decentralized finance protocol. You can use Augur for insurance. This is finance. This is decentralized finance. Yield farming, fruit coins is not finance. It's not decentralized finance. What they've done, look, a lot of the business model of Ethereum has been to launch useless tokens that people use for gambling. They do pumps and dumps with a bunch of useless tokens that come up and then go out. And the main innovation that was very, very popular this summer was to say, hey, how do we get liquidity? Because exchanges are not going to list all of these tokens. And if exchanges are not going to list them, the traders can't really play games with them. And so the way you do it is that you reward people for providing liquidity to them. That's the whole concept of yield farming. Massively successful, but it's not finance. It's gambling. There's nothing wrong per se with gambling if people do it responsibly and want to enjoy it. But at least do it in a place where the rake is a little smaller. Because right now it's extremely expensive to do so, and most of the rake ends up being buried in electricity because as Ethereum is a proof of work network, and so all of these fees, all of the MEV, so that's minor extractable values that's being left on the table, that's all burned as electricity. So it's a bit of a waste, and it's certainly it's certainly something that they marketed very successfully, but I don't think it's something to emulate, and I don't think it's something to celebrate either.
All right, so you've highlighted the problem there with Ethereum, but can you extrapolate out a little bit more how Tezos provides a solution?
So I was going to the second part of your question, which is network effects. So Ethereum has a huge advantage of being a first mover in a smart contract space in the same way that Ethereum has a huge advantage in being the first mover in cryptocurrency space. So the difficulty with network effect is that we think a lot of times of companies which have built very successful network effects. And then one thing we forget is that a company will defend its network effects through legal means by creating closed gardens. If you look at Facebook, at one point they had a vibrant ecosystem of games on their platform, and then when they saw that Zynga was becoming a little powerful, they cut off their API. Twitter cut off their API. When Airbnb started, they would let you cross-post your listing to Craigslist. Craigslist shut that down. So the network effect that you see, they're not self-sustaining, they are maintained actively. In a decentralized and open system, it's a lot harder to do this kind of things. One more example. I don't know if you around 2000s, I remember having maybe like 5 or 6 messenger clients. People were talking using ICQ and MSN and AOL Messenger and all of these. And you had this like multiple IM client that were connecting to all of these protocols. And what the protocol kept doing is just like breaking the standard so that they would not be able to interoperate. That's not really going to happen, I think, in a network that's open and decentralized. And so in some sense, interoperability solutions are going to weaken those network effects. It so happens today that it's very hard to port consensus state from one chain to another. It's not an easy problem. It's also hard for contracts to talk to each other when they're on different chains. And scalability and throughputs are limited. But as interoperability improves, as scalability improves, in a way, a lot of these network effects become weakened. So the one network effect which I think matters a great deal is the one as a store of value. I think that's something that's meaningful. The network effect as, oh, we're providing a platform for computation, I don't think that it can sustain technological innovation. And I see it betting very heavily on that effect.
Right. So then I guess I wonder, do you see the current state of the market as still inherently immature? And if so, what then takes it to that next level of maturity where there's a sort of more distinction? It's just a matter of time, fidelity, there's got to be a bubble and burst, more development in the space. Well, what's sort of the next step?
The next step. Well, I think this goes in waves, and some protocols have been able to surf a wave of use cases and narratives that didn't make sense, and then jump onto the next narratives, and have been quite successful at doing that. At some point, you run out of bullshit narratives, so you have to focus on the things which are going to be here to stay. And my take is like, rather than try to surf on the wave of saying like, oh, the problem is blockchains don't talk to each other and all of that, I'd rather focus on where I think the use cases are going to be in the long run. And so they're primarily financial use cases. And no, I don't call trading virtual potato coins finance. So financial use cases, insurance, I think is going to be important. Tokenization of assets is going to be important, and the interactions and interplay between those different primitives.
And is this, in your mind, is this sort of, I don't know if it might be a bit dramatic to call them protocol wars, but hell, let's be a little bit dramatic for the moment. Are these sort of protocol wars and sort of fights playing out at the moment, in your mind, zero sum? I mean, do we end up in a situation where 1, 2, let's say up to 5 networks end up taking the pie and everything else goes to the trash can? Or is there space in a mature market for multiple networks, multiple protocols to work collectively and interchangeably, each focusing on different elements of the market?
No, it's mostly zero sum, which doesn't mean it like zero sum doesn't mean it's like strictly winner take all. I think people can can still carve some space for themselves, but primarily it's winner take all. But again, like I said, it's not clear to me that open and decentralized systems can capture rent for usage. By that I mean the general idea of like application platforms like Ethereum is to say there's going to be a bunch of applications. These applications are going to be useful, and we're going to capture some of that value and reflect it in our token. So like if there's a bunch of useful applications, somehow the Ether token is going to be more valuable. So today, there's absolutely no link, no economic link between Ether and applications running on Ether, because you don't need to use Ether to pay for your fees, and Ethers do not grant you block creation rights. So if they move to a world where somehow they stop being proof of work, and if they develop a proof of stake solution instead, then maybe that changes, because now the tokens give you block creation rights. If they decide to burn fees instead, so there's a couple of things that they can do. But even if they do that, like I said, it's an open and decentralized system. the more that people want to use it, the more fees are going to rise. And the more fees are going to rise, the more substitutes become appealing. That's not the case with a store of value. With a store of value, the higher the demand, the more useful it becomes actually. And it doesn't have this substitution effect. So in some sense, it's, yes, we're going to see multiple like smart contract platforms, but I don't think that smart contract platforms as smart contract platforms, as opposed to stores of value and cryptocurrencies, are going to capture much value. I think it's going to end up being commodity, just like commodity computation, which is not inherently very costly, and when the price falls to the cost, like the margins are going to compress, and almost be honest.
To change tack a little bit, I was listening to an interview you did last year with Tom Shaughnessy, in which you discussed one of the key things that stuck out to me is this idea of censorship resistance, rather, and the sort of question that often needs to be asked, and often isn't in this sort of follow-up sense when it comes to censorship resistance, of who are you censoring against? Who exactly is it that you're creating this sort of censorship for? Is it the company censoring itself from being able to block its own users? Is it governments? Is it regulators? And I'd sort of like to hear your latest thoughts on this topic, and perhaps expound on a little bit in relation to the current market.
I think you sum it up. Like sometimes it's sometimes you predict for censorship against yourself. It's kind of like a way to tie your own hands and say, come build on this platform because I have given you very, very strong guarantees that I'm not going to cut you off. It's kind of like, I mentioned, Facebook or Facebook or Twitter closing their APIs. And so one way you could bootstrap a platform is by saying, I am not going to cut off my APIs, and I'm relinquishing control of the platform just so that I can guarantee to people that it's a good idea to go and build on this platform. So that's like predicting for censorship against yourself, and I think that's a use case. It can also be predicting for censorship against malicious actors. It could be it could be oppressive governments, for example. But sometimes also it could be just like commercial actors. Commercial actors can refuse to deal with some people. There was a thing in the US called Operation Choke Point, which was completely extra legal. And it's basically, I think, the FDIC who put pressure on the banks to stop banking some lending places and some sex workers. And there was no legal basis for doing that, but they just said like, hey, you know what? It would be good if you didn't give them banking services. And all of these people were pushed off. And this was done without any legislation passed. This is completely extra legal, and it's a use of discretionary power, which I think is dangerous. So protecting people against this type of non-legislative overreach is potentially interesting.
I think it definitely is potentially interesting, and I think very salient at the moment. Obviously the use cases brought to the public mind is the current actions that are taking by Facebook and Twitter and others to block President Trump and others from certain access to their platforms. And I'm not interested in getting caught up in the personal sort of politics of that right now, but more from a conceptual level. This has entered the public salience as a conversation, in that particular case in relation to social media more than finance. But certainly I think questions are now being asked about the power of corporations to unilaterally take this sort of action against users on their networks. And that, as you rightly pointed out, this could extend well beyond the social media space into the financial, accessibility, whatever it might be. Do you think that sort of salience makes blockchain more relevant, and how do you think that can enter the public discourse?
So yes and no. The first thing I want to say is people are looking at this and they're saying like, oh, Twitter is so powerful, Facebook is so powerful because they can cut off, Trump. First of all, like, Trump has access to the entire press corps. Like he can go on TV anytime. He can say anything and have all the newspapers reprinted. So the idea that somehow he's blocked from communication is a little silly. The other thing is that you've had the New York Times for like now well over a year pressure Facebook and Twitter and saying to them, how dare you not, how dare you leave Trump on your platform? You're allowing this, you're part of this is your fault because you're giving him a platform, and so on and so forth. And then the day that Facebook and Twitter removed Trump, New York Times is saying, well, this raises interesting question about the power of Twitter. Oh my God. I mean, they're just trying to shoot down the competitors, because fundamentally, like, Twitter and Facebook are competitors for eyeballs with the New York Times.
Right.
The other thing is that we're going to have a Democratic administration in the US, and a lot of the Democrats campaign on breaking down big tech. They were like, yes, we need to break down Facebook, we need to break down Google and Amazon. And so, of course, as soon as the wind changed, so Amazon, like AWS, cut off Parler. And I don't think they're doing it because they're like, oh, we're this powerful company. They're not doing it because they're powerful and they can do this. They're doing it because they're weak. They're doing it because they're scared that the government is going to come and expropriate them. So it's completely understandable. Same thing with the banks. I don't think the banks somehow didn't want to like provide bank accounts to sex workers. More customers is better for them. They were pressured by the government to do so. So there's always a little bit of an ambiguity here, because it might seem like, oh, well, it's private actors that can do what they want, but are they really doing what they want if there's pressure? If you have an entire apparatus of laws that you can discretionally apply and say, well, maybe now we look into antitrust unless you play ball with us. It becomes an extension of it becomes an extension of power, which again it doesn't go through the legislative process, which I think is problematic. So as a reaction to that, I think we will see decentralization of social media. I think it will happen, and I don't think the decentralization is somehow better than the centralized model. It's just like a response to it's a response to the pressure that's just just how it evolves. You put some sort of like evolutionary pressure on this thing to resist censorship, and it evolves into decentralization. But I don't think that blockchains are going to have to play a major role in this. It's definitely going to play a role. So I think we're going to see identity systems based on the blockchains. We might even see protection against spam by having stashing mechanisms where someone guarantees with a bond that something is not spam. Maybe DAOs for controlling certain parameters. So we will see some blockchain involvement, but I think the blockchain involvement is going to be, in fact, relatively minor. It's a useful building block, don't get me wrong, but it's a joke of they used to, when the TSA started confiscating nail clippers on plane. I heard this joke that stayed with me, which was, if you can take over a plane with a nail clipper, you can take over a plane without a nail clipper. If you can build a successful decentralized Facebook with a blockchain, I guarantee you can build a decentralized Facebook, successful decentralized Facebook without a blockchain. Like, it's useful to have the blockchain, but like that's not the meat of it. And we've known how to kind of build these systems for a while. Federated systems, like you see in Matrix, like you see in Jabber, like you used to see in Usenet. There's a key element. Historically, the problem with this system has been spam and has been the lack of funding. But if there's, if there's genuine usage, I think we'll see patterns where the monetization comes at the UX level, like people building front ends for open protocol. Just that no one really had an incentive to do it before, because why would you disrupt your own platform and your own business model? But I do think we'll see it happen. I just don't think it's going to be this giant boon for blockchain. Like, yes, it will, some cryptocurrencies and is going to be involved in that, and some blockchain element are going to be involved. Just it's not a backbone of it.
But so I mean, I want to play the role of a blockchain evangelist for a moment, and just sort of say, those out there that you would hear, parroting online saying that blockchain is the ultimate solution to any of these centralized problems, any of these sort of weak hand situations, as you discussed, that these companies aren't really as strong against regulators as many would like to think that they are. The blockchain is this ultimate solution, and while the barriers may still be a little bit high, development costs still a little bit high, execution still a bit difficult, ultimately, as the technology develops and as distribution of blockchains around the world develops, they will become the ultimate solution. What would you say against that?
I would say it's BS or wishful thinking. I don't know if the people think this, actually believe it or not. It's not a technological problem. It's not like, oh, if only the blockchains were more scalable, we could do it, but they're not even scalable. It doesn't actually solve a problem that you have. Even if tomorrow you give me a blockchain which has 1 million transactions per second and can store all this data, it's not actually solving a huge problem. You see, I have a very old blog post on the topic. I think it's back in 2014, which is what are blockchains good for? And blockchains are good for representing any states that mutates. And you might say, well, blockchains are immutable. So what do you mean mutation? But that's the thing. They represent mutable data, a mutable state with an immutable data structure. That's the main trick. And the only thing that you mutate is where is the head of the blockchain. So if you want to represent a payment system, that's great because I have money and then now you have money. We've mutated something. Most of social media is almost append only. You just keep adding more and more and more information. There's not a concept of a property title changing hands. And this is the problem that blockchains mostly solve. It's a double spending problem. If you don't have some form of the double spending problem, you can have the best blockchain in the world, the greatest thing. It's not going to solve a real problem for you. So, like I said, I think they will, like identity is one of these things where you might have like you could build some PKI systems on blockchains, and that might be somewhat useful. But it's only a very, very small part of this. So I don't think it's a technological problem. I think people want to sell some soup, and the way that they sell the soup is by saying it's going to like revolutionize social media. I don't know to which extent they buy it. A lot of times it's just people are not thinking from first principles, and they'll say, oh, there's fake news. Fake news is a problem with the truth. People don't know what the truth is. But wait a second, blockchains establish truth about transaction. Therefore, blockchain plus news equals truth to news. And no, it doesn't work that way. Like a blockchain can establish truth over like some clearly mathematically well-defined facts. It's not, just because it creates truth in like this narrow aspect and area doesn't mean it's going to like all of a sudden creates news in news. That's really lazy thinking. And there's a lot of lazy thinking in this space. Like just pattern matching. It's very frustrating. Sorry, I don't want to.
I can see it. I can see the frustration in your face. No, but yeah, this is an important point for us to air out and to consider, because I guess, when particularly we have so many new, users, developers, whatever coming into the space, I think this is always an important time, during these hype cycles, during these bubble cycles, when everyone from young software engineers to just speculative investors are coming on board and wanting to hear about the magic of blockchain, and this is how they're going to experience it for the first time. I guess it's important to define these parameters a little bit, because so many people get told by these evangelists and whatnot that blockchain is the ultimate solution to everybody's problems in and around the world. And I guess then if you're saying that's not the case, and you make a compelling point for that argument, then is blockchain just set to narrowly resolve some issues in the financial space, or is there a wider use case that can be developed beyond those that are in the space?
But I don't think there's anything narrow about the financial space. I think it's just less well known because a lot more people interact with social media on their day-to-day lives than they interact with the financial system. And so it might look as if it's much bigger, but I don't think that's necessarily the case. I think financial use cases are very large and very wide. So I wouldn't call that narrow. And again, like I said, I do think that there will be interactions between blockchains and decentralized social media. I'm not bashing the idea of decentralized social media. I think it will happen. Mm-hmm. And I'm not saying it won't have interaction with blockchains. It will. It's just that blockchain is not the magic ingredient that was missing all along for making decentralized social media. What was missing is demand. So
then I guess if we're going to focus in on the financial space inherently, looking ahead and projecting out, over the sort of next year or so, and you can pick your timeline, where do you see that fundamental innovation really taking place, in the next sort of short to mid-term period?
In the blockchain space?
Yes.
In terms of use, I think first of all, it's a slow rollout. People like to try to have. People have this idea that somehow innovations all happen on like a faster and faster schedule over time. And the common example that they give is, look, it took people a lot less time to move from mobile phones to smartphones than it took them to adopt a computer, which means that the technological trend is that everything gets adopted faster. And I think that's a fallacious example, because when the computer arrived, people didn't really know what to do with it. There was not that much software. And so it took a lot longer. Whereas when a smartphone arrived, people already had cell phones and people already had computers. So the value prop is kind of immediately obvious. It's like, hey, it's your computer on a phone. There's not much to it, right? For people to adopt. And I think you're fundamentally changing the patterns of interaction that people have with the technology. And so I think it's going to take longer to really become a part of people's life. But for me, again, I think the use cases are going to be around decentralized insurance, also lowering the ticket price for financial primitives. More participatory crowdfunding, I think, is going to be a component. And in general, there's places in the world where you don't have access to a lot of instruments for saving, and being able to buy, let's say, a share of a global diversified real estate portfolio and pay a few cents only as commission and buy as little as $10 worth of it. That's not something that's really possible today, and it's one of the I think it's one of the use cases that we're going to see emerge.
So would you say you're a believer in the sort of power of blockchain as a democratizer of financial services globally?
Yeah, that's fair to say. Yeah.
So then I guess it comes to the next follow-up question. If, as we're attempting to democratize these financial services across the world, and as that sort of gets more ingrained and grows, and we see more institutions coming on board, and we see greater development of chains and protocols and networks themselves, what role do you think? And I'll put this to a global scale, and you can pick how you refine it.
Let me just try to fix my the light here. It's crazy bad. This is better. Yes, it's much better.
Yes, wonderful.
Go ahead.
All right. So, what role do you feel that globally that regulators are going to be able to play when it comes to the blockchain space in the next few years? I mean, seems to be a growing space where attention is more being paid to blockchain. So, what role do you think regulators have?
So there's one thing that the regulators have done right in this space, and I hope that they're going to continue doing it right, is that they've regulated the endpoints and not the technology itself. Mm-hmm. They're saying, like, if you're an exchange, this is what you need to do. If you're a user, this is what you need to do. So they regulate the use of the technology and not the technology itself by saying, like, oh, your technology must do this and that. And that's very commendable. That's the right approach to have to these things, and so I hope that continues.
Do you think that's being done on purpose, or do you think that's being done due to a lack of awareness of the technology itself? That this is the thing, this is the points they understand, so that's what they regulate.
I don't know, because it's not, I've never been a regulator, so I don't know what, I don't know how they operate behind closed doors. I think part of it is pragmatism, because it's just so easy for anyone to develop software anywhere on Earth and just put it out there. So there's one part of pragmatism. I think there is some sensitivity of, like, not crushing innovation. That's real and that's present. And part of it is just because that's how they think of it, because historically they've dealt with regulating actors. In fact, if you look at most of the financial regulation, it exists initially, at least, because you have financial intermediaries. So a lot of the time when you have a financial intermediary, the financial intermediary can run away with the money, which causes increased risk of fraud. And so as a result, you have a lot of regulations which focuses on these intermediaries. And so just by a natural extension of that, they are focused on intermediaries like cryptocurrency exchanges, for example. Basically, anytime there's some sort of fiduciary relationship between two actors is where you're going to see regulation. But the beauty of blockchain is precisely that you can have financial interaction without necessarily needing a fiduciary relationship, because you're dealing with a smart contract and not with someone who can take your fund or betray any type of fiduciary duty. That's, to me, what's super interesting about the technology.
So this brings me onto my next topic of focus, and I think it's one that sort of interacts very, very interestingly in that nexus of regulation and of blockchain development and usability. And it's a topic I know you have an interest in, of stablecoins and the current state of the stablecoin market.
Yeah.
You've labeled stablecoins a misnomer in the past. You've labeled them sort of flawed in some ways, but also incredibly interesting and useful in others. Can you give us an update on your sort of current views on the stablecoin market as a whole? And I say this is particularly salient at the moment, given the current conversations going on with Tether all across the crypto space. But we can pick your thoughts as we go along.
So if anyone's watching this, I have a great video about it where I go in detail. So I recommend you to look at that. But I'm going to give you the short version of it. Mm-hmm. when I say it's a misnomer, I think there's two very, very different things that exist. One is stable coins like USDC or like Tether or like Libra. That's one thing. And on the other hand, you have algorithmically stabilized cryptocurrencies, which actually cannot achieve a peg. It doesn't work. So I call those robocoin. They're completely different, and that's why it's a misnomer to call the latter stable coins. So the first one, they are essentially very simple from a technological perspective. They're just a tokenized bank account. You take someone's bank account, and then you tokenize it, you put it on a chain, and when someone presents you a token, you give them money out of the account, and when someone puts money in the account, you give them a token. That's how Tether is supposed to work, or like USDC work. And yes, they've become really big, primarily because it's been hard for exchanges to get banking relationships. And because it's been so hard for exchanges to get banking relationship, they have used this as a bit of a crutch. So that's been one of the main reasons for the rise of these stable coins. I'm mostly a technologist. I'm primarily interested in the financial engineering and the technology behind the other kinds, the robocoin. That's where my interest lies. The first one is pretty straightforward. It's more of a, I think, possibly like a regulatory question than it is of a technical question. And so I don't have a whole lot to say about those.
No, let's dig into as you call them, the robocoins. What are you sort of seeing in terms of that space, innovation-wise, in terms of how they're classified and distinguished, both within the community and those using it? What are sort of your thoughts on the latest development in that space?
Well, the first thing to know is that it's impossible to get a peg if what you're doing is not something as simple as tokenizing a bank account. And you might say, well, wait a second, DAI and MakerDAOs, they have a peg. Well, no, they don't, because DAI is not really the coin here. The coin is CDAI, compounding DAI. If you have something that says, look, it's worth $1, and by the way, I'm going to give you extra money every year. Well, you're not really having a peg, you're appreciating against a peg, right? So they have a stability fee, and the stability fee, in some sense, it balances out the supply of DAI and the demand for DAI. So if a lot of people want to open CDPs, they want to borrow against their ETH, for example, they want to create DAI, and not so many people are interested in holding DAI, then in that scenario, you're going to have a positive stability fee saying like, hey, hold DAI because we really want to issue DAI and we'll pay you for that. Okay, that's been the regime for DAI for a long time. But you have another scenario where a lot of people want to hold the coin because it's convenient. Look, it's stabilized. I can use it on a blockchain. It's possibly more censorship resistant. So so in that scenario, people may be less interested in issuing DAI than people are in holding DAI. And the clearing stability fee for that situation might very well be negative, which is something that MakerDAO cannot handle. So if you're looking, the best you can do with an algorithmically stabilized coin is to have something that's going to maybe slowly appreciate over the peg or maybe slowly depreciate over the peg. It's going to drift. So it will be a lot more stable than a cryptocurrency, for example. It's not going to have maybe this like giant moves, but it's not going to hold a peg perfectly. You have to have some sort of a float that happens. And that's, I think, what people have been missing in the space.
Does that not? I mean, and excuse me if my understanding of the underlying tech is wrong in this sort of understanding, but does that not get fairly close in some ways to a fiat currency? I mean, in a way that it floats loosely around a peg, but is considerably more stable than other commodities or assets in a space. I mean, obviously, key distinctions being it's not run by a government, but
yeah. So it's not that far from the it's not that far from the job that the central bank would do. In some sense, you could think of the central bank as saying, okay, we want to maintain the purchasing power of our currency. So if the purchasing power of the currency somehow goes down, you want more people to start holding you want people to start holding on to the currency as opposed to spending it. So you're going to increase the interest rate, and you're going to do that basically by selling some of your assets and then buying back some of the dollar in circulation. And the other thing that you might do is that if somehow the purchasing power appreciates too much, then what you can do is you're going to print more money and buy assets. So you basically keep this balance sheet of assets, but you do have a problem here. You also going to have a zero bound, because if as you keep buying bonds, the yield in bonds is going to collapse to zero, and at some point you end up with no no productive assets that you can buy, you end up even buying unproductive assets. If you push the bond yields to zero, at some point you can have defaults, and if you have defaults, then now you're not able to buy back the money that you put in circulation. And if you're buying government bonds, saying, well, government bonds are not going to default, right? Because we can print more money. But in that case, you're still using the fact that you're going to print money as a crutch. So historically, that's why we've had central banks buy pure store values like gold, for example, because gold doesn't really have a yield. So it's not like as you buy more gold, gold doesn't become like less productive or even a money losing proposition. So that's the reason why you have this pure store of value, which are still on the balance sheet of banks.
And I guess I wonder, so then would you say that the inherent advantage is just that you algorithmically control this central bank style distribution? You remove the human factor from it. Is that where the inherent advantage of these sort of, as you call them, robo-coins come into play?
Well, there's more advantages. So if you're looking at your central banks, the way that they inject the money is through the financial system, and you have a thing called the cantillon effect, where when money gets injected, it first benefits the people who are closest to the money, and then the people who are a little further, a little less, and then a little less, a little less. So when they print a lot of money, you will see inflation of the financial system first, and then asset prices, and progressively it makes its way through the economy. But if you're further away, you see your savings diluted more than you gain from somehow receiving more money. So for anyone who's on a fixed income, anyone who's on a salary, it's not a great proposition. So it's a system that does breed some inequalities, and you don't have this. With an algorithmically controlled system, you don't have this. It's a flat organization. It's a flat structure. So there's no cotillion insiders and cotillion outsiders. So that's a big difference.
Again, just to make sure I clarify my understanding, as you start to get more intermediaries potentially coming into the way, as you get a more nuanced and developed ecosystem, couldn't theoretically you end up back at that same space? Obviously, again, not centered around a government, just centered around the currency itself, or does the inherent structure of the system prevent there being intermediaries that create that cantillon effect?
No. The cantillon effect is not because you have an intermediary that comes in. It's just because by law, this is how it works. If tomorrow a central bank wanted to inflate by saying, we're going to inflate by just taking a bunch of money and just crediting it to everyone's bank account in proportion to their balance, you would not have this type of cantillon effect. So it's just a matter of how the money is injected in the first place.
So then, what do you see as the role, to get a little bit beyond the technology, but what do you see as the role of these, robo currencies, robo stablecoins, sort of as you call them, as the technology becomes fully developed, as it becomes more integrated, let's get a little, speculative and utopian here, projecting out over time. What role do you see these playing? Replacing, the inherent fiat currencies, helping to be a sort of a financial hedge, where does this sort of role play out?
I think it provides an alternative to a cryptocurrency. So the benefit of a cryptocurrency is as a store of value, but it can also be very volatile. And if you start building robocoins, which are backed by cryptocurrencies, you still get the benefit of the censorship resistance. And you get the benefits of more stability, but you do it at the cost of having a potentially negative stability fee. If it really gets adopted, then you go into the regime where you're basically paying people for holding the risky collateral. And so, in some sense, I think it's the best of both worlds. It's for people who want to use an instrument that's stable because they want to enter into long-term contracts, for example. That's perfect. And they're going to pay a cost for this, which is a negative stability fee, and for the convenience of having a stability fee, and that is being paid in some way to the people who are holding the risky collateral. So it's in some sense, this is what finance does. Finance shifts risk and cash flows between different parties, and that's a way of divorcing this. It's a way of basically ensuring the volatility risk of the cryptocurrency in another instrument.
Fascinating.
Put it another way, people talk about cryptocurrencies as payment network, not just as store of value, but as payment networks. And I think that systems like robocoins are going to be much more useful for payment rails than the pure cryptocurrencies themselves.
Right. Providing that necessary stability in a market which, as anyone who's been here for more than 5 minutes knows, suffers some pretty major volatility shocks. All right, Arthur, I would love to continue picking your brain on this for many hours to come, but we have to reach towards some sort of conclusion here. I've been asking as a sort of general thematic question of a lot of people I've been interviewing over the course of this conference, to sort of give their views, as we're seeing a market explosion, a surge of interest around the world, and new people are coming into the crypto space. I'd be interested to know what piece of advice you would give, and given your field of interest and expertise, to new, let's say, developers, technologists, entering into the space, entering into the crypto space. What sort of advice would you give to someone new and wanting to really come to grips with the crypto space?
I would say think from first principles. Like, try to understand the entire stack, understand the rationale behind every technical decisions, and don't just pattern match. Don't just say like, oh, these two ideas sound interesting and they share some words and therefore they're related. You need to have a mental model where you can deconstruct and analyze everything if you want to think clearly about the space. That would be the first advice. And the second advice would be, of course, to check the Tezos documentation, because it's an awesome project and you should build on Tezos.
Wonderful, good. I'm glad you got a good plug in there. It's important to end on a good note and make sure that everyone's aware of what's going on. Arthur, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today, reveal a little bit of your, well thought out and clearly, deeply perceptive thoughts on the space from that technological perspective, that economic perspective. It's so critical, particularly when there's so much hype and a lot of crap being spoken at the moment by people less well informed than themselves. So I appreciate you coming on to be with us here. And for those watching, keep staying with us at Reimagine. We've got so much going on, so many great interviews. Arthur, thanks again for being with us.
Thanks so much for having me, Asher.